I did my final project and presentation on Egypt and its geography, traditions, and regional resources. On the first slide, I included a map of Egypt that I would commonly use in a classroom due to its bright colors and cartoon-like images. I feel as if this would be more relatable to students. And looking at the second image, I just provided examples of things that we commonly think of when we think of Egypt, such as mummies, pharaohs, pyramids, camels, pottery, different religious Egyptian symbols. On the second slide, I looked at geographical facts about Egypt, including a more traditional map of Egypt and its surrounding areas that would affect its available resources. An image of the Aswan High Dam. Egypt is home to Aswan High Dam. It's the world's largest dam and was built to contain the raging waters of the world's longest river, which is the Nile. Also, Egypt is often divided into two sections, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. The sections are named this way because the Nile flows from south to north. The main water source in Egypt is the Nile, as rainfalls in Egypt are limited, and today the country relies mainly on irrigation systems for growing their crops. Looking at Egyptian geography and its influence on art, ancient Egyptians used 6 colors in their art: white, black, red, yellow, green, and blue. These colors came from local minerals, and to make paint, ancient Egyptians ground minerals into a powder and then mixed them with a plant or animal-based glue so they would stick to surfaces like walls. Ancient Egyptian pottery was made of the mud of the Nile and found in places outside of Egypt, such as Palestine, which means that the Egyptians also exported their goods. There were 2 types of clay commonly used by ancient Egyptians. The first and more common one is the Nile clay, and the other is the marl clay found in Upper Egypt. Nile clay is the result of eroded material in the Ethiopian mountains moving into Egypt by the Nile River, where marl clay is a yellow-white stone that occurs in limestone deposits. These deposits were created when the waters of the Nile and its tributaries brought sediment into Egypt and deposited along the desert edge. I've also included some images that show examples of the different types of pottery. This is what Nile clay pottery would look like. This is an example of marl clay pottery, and this is just an example of traditional Egyptian pottery and common symbols that would be used on pieces of Egyptian pottery and other forms of art. Moving on to Egyptian traditions, coffee and red tea are the most common drinks in Egypt. However, accidentally spilling coffee is a good omen. When someone spills coffee, most of the surrounding people will tell them this is a good sign, meaning that good things will happen to them. Ancient Egyptians had a written language made entirely out of pictures called hieroglyphs. Each image represented a different sound, and the characters were of animals, everyday objects, or abstract symbols. Cats were very important and special in Egypt and were considered to be sacred. Most Egyptian households had a pet cat because they thought it would bring them good luck. As far as pottery goes, ancient Egyptians didn't only use it in their daily lives. It was a central feature in tombs, where they would leave containers of food and goods for the deceased to use on their journey through the afterlife. The pottery would be engraved or painted with religious incantations or symbols to help the soul of the deceased. On this slide, I included examples of the various Egyptian traditions discussed on this slide. This is an example of Egyptian hieroglyphs. This would be a common cat statue that would be found in Egypt, as they did think they were sacred and good luck. This image is of men in Egypt digging up Egyptian pottery artifacts and separating them to look at the different types of pottery that they discovered. And this image just shows an example of what red tea and coffee would look like and how they would drink this in Egypt. My final slide about Egypt looks at their resources. Egypt has deposits of petroleum, natural gas, iron ore, phosphates, and various minerals. For their wildlife, they have foxes, jackals, boars, and hyenas. Crocodiles also live in the Upper Nile, and Egypt has more than 300 species of birds and 100 species of fish, with cotton being their major export crop. Egypt's also an important producer of rice, wheat, corn, beans, fruit, and vegetables, and livestock raised includes cattle, water buffalo, sheep, and goat. On this slide, I also included images to offer examples of these Egyptian resources, including Egyptian medium grain rice, Egyptian cotton, and an Egyptian red fox that would be common to that region in Egypt. Moving on to visual art and a student-created piece of Egyptian-style pottery. This piece of student-created Egyptian-style pottery served as a performance-based assessment that would allow the student to demonstrate their understanding of Egyptian pottery, symbols that were valued in Egyptian arts and culture, and their connection to the geography and resources of Egypt as demonstrated in the Egyptian pottery artifact lesson plan. In order to teach students how to create Egyptian-style pottery, each student will be provided with numbered step-by-step visual instructions as a guide for how to create handmade pottery. I've also included 3 different images to show the work that the student did throughout this lesson while creating Egyptian art. They've included various symbols that are important to Egyptian culture and did a great job completing this project. This slide covers the first page of my lesson plan. The subject is to create an Egyptian pottery artifact. Students are given a period of 5 days for 45 minutes a day to complete this project, and the lesson concept is the influence of geography, history, and culture on regional art. I wrote down the PA standards that connect with this lesson, the first one being identifying physical characteristics of places and regions to meet the geography requirement. The next 2 standards are arts-based, knowing, using, and demonstrating a variety of appropriate art elements and principles to produce, review, and revise original works in the arts, being able to analyze a work of art from historical and cultural perspectives, and in the English category, using information gained from text features to demonstrate understanding of a. This slide looks at the big ideas and essential questions that were considered important to this lesson. There are 2 big ideas. Location influences the goods and services available in a certain area, and the essential question to go along with that: how does the geography of an area influence what can be produced in that location? And the other big idea being cultural beliefs and traditions influence the creation of art, with the essential question being how does the way we live and what we believe influence our artistic expression? It also looks at eligible content that would commonly be addressed in state assessments and an expected skill for the student to be able to perform by the time 3rd graders were assessed in the state assessments for these skills. This one looks at using information gained from illustrations, maps, photographs, and words in a text to demonstrate understanding of the text, where, when, why, and how key events occur. This slide also looks at the objectives that would be included in this lesson plan and the goals that students would be expected to achieve by the end of the lesson. This slide looks at the materials that students would be given to successfully complete their pottery project, and also looks at opening activities and the introduction related to how the teacher would introduce the ideas of Egyptian pottery to students by showing examples of various types of Egyptian pottery and explaining the details and historical connections they had to ancient Egypt. After looking at the images of various types of Egyptian pottery, the teacher would ask students to write down at least 5 facts about Egyptian pottery that stood out to them, allowing the teacher to assess basic student understanding of information related to Egypt. The teacher would then hand out a worksheet on Egyptian symbols with a description of their meaning included and an article on Egyptian pottery. And then students will also be given their numbered step-by-step guide with visuals and directions to create handmade pottery to help them complete their Egyptian-style pottery creations. After looking over this information, students will meet in groups of 4 and discuss this information for a period of 20 minutes, with each group member contributing at least 5 ideas about how this information represents the influence of Egyptian history and culture on the creation of Egyptian pottery. After these group discussions are complete, students will go back to their desks and be given the supplies from the teacher to complete their pieces of Egyptian pottery. After students have completed their pieces of Egyptian pottery, the teacher will collect these and take the time to share each piece of art with the class. Students will be asked to raise their hands and share at least 5 Egyptian symbols observed on pottery created by their peers, as well as the meaning of these symbols. The teacher will talk about how these symbols represent what was considered important in Egyptian history and culture, and how different cultures choose different symbols or objects to represent what is important to them. This slide primarily looks at differentiation that could be used to help students be successful in their completion of this project. For example, when writing down at least 5 facts learned about Egyptian pottery that stood out to them, the teacher can walk around the room, offering prompts as needed to help students complete writing down these facts, and if needed, they could verbally share their responses to express their learning about Egyptian pottery, which could be beneficial to students that may struggle with written expression, like students who are English language learners or students with dyslexia or other developmental delays that make written expression a challenge. The teacher could also just walk around the room when students are writing down their 5 facts that stood out to them, offering assistance and prompts as needed to help students write down or express their thoughts. Before students participate in group discussions of the Egyptian symbol worksheets and the Egyptian pottery article, the teacher could give extra time for reading the article and processing the information, which could help students that need more time to process information they're reading, which could include students with attention issues that could make it more challenging to concentrate well enough to process written information in a limited period of time. Another example of differentiation that could be used could be that students could be given additional time for completion of their Egyptian style pottery and painting of Egyptian symbols, which could benefit students who have issues with fine motor skills that may need more time to complete their pottery and painting of the Egyptian symbol. This next section looks at closure and how the teacher will restate the lesson objective. The teacher will restate the objective by asking students to choose one symbol from the Egyptian symbol worksheet and share how it's connected with Egyptian art, geography, culture, or history. The teacher will also ask students to raise their hands and share why they think Egyptians chose or preferred certain symbols to represent their region, which allows students to use critical thinking skills and consider why certain objects or symbols are important to certain countries and regions, and allows the teacher a chance to reinforce the lesson objective and student understanding of the influence that geography, culture, and history have on art produced in various regions. This next section covers accommodations and modifications, which is really just more of a step-by-step breakdown of what the teacher would do to address the differentiation previously mentioned in this lesson, and would allow any teacher that was looking at this lesson plan to know what steps to take to meet the unique student needs in the classroom as it relates to this lesson. After the accommodations and modifications used by the teacher, we look at various types of assessments that would determine that students had mastered learning objectives, looking at pre-assessments. After sharing images and different examples of Egyptian pottery, the teacher will ask students to write down at least 5 facts about Egyptian pottery that stood out to them, which will help the teacher assess basic student understanding about information presented related to Egyptian pottery, and allows them to make necessary lesson plan changes, if any, to meet the unique needs of each. Looking at summative assessment, after students complete their pieces of Egyptian pottery, the teacher will collect these from students and take the time to share each piece of art with the class. After viewing the pottery of their peers, students will be asked to raise their hands and share at least 5 Egyptian symbols they observed on the pottery created by their peers, as well as the meaning of these symbols. Approximately 90% of students should be able to share and correctly identify at least one Egyptian symbol and its meaning from the work of their peers. Looking at formative assessment, as students participate in group discussions with their peers after reading the Egyptian pottery article and looking at Egyptian symbol worksheets, students should be able to contribute at least 5 ideas about how this information shows the influence of Egyptian history and culture on the creation of Egyptian pottery. This slide looks at the Egyptian pottery artifact rubric, which uses a descending scale from 5 to 1 to measure student progress for a total score of 25. The categories include facts shared about Egyptian pottery and images, ideas shared in peer group discussions, Egyptian symbols and meanings found on peer pottery, symbols included on student-created pottery, and overall art. The overall effort category is included to differentiate for students who may struggle with lesson expectations in other scored areas, giving them an opportunity to achieve a higher score. And the total score they can receive on this project at the highest amount is 25. This last slide is just a list of all the reference I used to gather information for this presentation, as well as the links needed to find and locate the information.